limitations, they fall under the rhetorical aspect of writing, but they have some direct overlap with the technological accessibility components too. So if you remember that video, I think right now on YouTube I just have a lecture for it. So it's near the end of the lecture on technological readability and stuff like that. But constraints and limitations are rhetorical considerations because they change your ability to get your message out. And as a writer, you want to be aware of what constraints you have so that you can make intentional choices about how to operate within those constraints or find a way to break the constraints. So you have to either change the context completely so that the constraints no longer matter, or find a way to operate within those constraints effectively. And that's really what it comes down to. So let's talk about how we can use these, how we should be looking at writing situations in light of three different types of categories. Okay, so constraints and limitations should, the definition should be kind of obvious, but they are things that stop, block, or limit us from accomplishing our purpose in a particular context and a particular genre for particular audiences. So there are at least three categories of constraints, and we could probably add some more depth to this, but we're just going to talk about these three. Technical constraints, physical constraints, and social constraints. So when we talk... I'm going to start with physical first, though. Sorry for the misorder. But physical constraints are when we physically cannot reach our audience or cannot use the technology a certain way. This would be, it's like if you are stranded on a desert island and you need to get an SOS message out and there's no box with a cell phone in it. What do you try and do? What is the way that you frame your message? Well, maybe you tried the bonfire thing. Maybe you get really big logs on the ground. You try and send smoke signals. You put a message in a bottle and hope it makes it to somebody sometime. That physical constraint is going to change the way that you write and try and contact your audience. So, you want to be aware of physical constraints. Linked with accessibility, there are other things we might consider. Someone's ability to use certain screens or certain technologies can make it can make it harder for certain types of communication to happen. Sometimes I have students who don't email or aren't good with a lot of the screen work because of a medical condition or something like that, and so it makes it hard for them to use certain types of technologies, but not others. Some people have to have blue screen filters over their to help the light with their eyes and reacting and stuff. That was incredibly articulate. Other things are some people maybe they're not good at typing, or they have carpal tunnel or arthritis or something like that makes it hard to use a keyboard. Or maybe they're someone with MS, and so their hands have a hard time gripping pencils sometimes. Those are all physical constraints that a writer has to take into account to determine what the best way to get their message out is. I've seen people with these sorts of physical constraints problem solve by using alternate technologies. I've seen people do video comments instead of typed out comments. I've seen them use a stylus in their hand that they could grip so that they could do the swipe method on a tablet keyboard, and that was really cool. Now I use the swipe keyboard on my Android, and it's awesome. You can't do that on iPhones as far as I know. Meh. With that, I've also seen the same person when their arm got tired, do comments with the stylus in their mouth, because that was just the thing. So you find ways around. It's the same reason why you hear cool you can see cool news publications about people who paint with their toes, because their hands didn't form fully in the womb or something like that. So these are physical constraints. I cannot reach my audience with this message physically. Sometimes it's literally my body physical. Sometimes it's a geographical distance. If we think back 100, 200 years ago, when we're dealing a lot with the postal service and they had to have horses, like all of that are physical constraints. When the ocean's in the way and there's not telegraphs and there's not cell phones or regular phones or computers, those sorts of constraints are physical constraints. And so those are things to be aware of, depending on what you need to communicate and to whom. So it's good to be aware of those different technologies, or technological constraints or limitations, the things that might change, the things that might limit or change the way you communicate, or things that you might have to adapt to if you're wanting to talk to a specific group or a specific audience. Okay, so physical constraints. Next, we'll jump to technical constraints. Technical constraints are the limitations of the technology to do what you want it to do. There used to be, when Facebook first started, or maybe a few years after it, there was the ability to do things like you could add tags and play with the HTML and make it bold and that sort of thing, and almost create it like a blog a little bit. And so some of those things have been removed, like you can't change the code anymore. Other technologies, if we're thinking. Other technical constraints might be, I just literally forgot my charger and my power is going to die, so this isn't going to work. This might be a blend of the physical and technological, or technical, but that would be things where something about the way you have to use the technology makes it hard or changes the way you have to write. Another thing to think about are things like the tweet character limits. Used to be 140, I think, and that was, I believe, intentionally designed to fit into, because of the 160 character kind of text message SMS limit at the time, years and years ago, maybe a decade at this point. And then they just recently, a few years ago, upped it, doubled the character limit to 280, and so now you can do a longer tweet. But those are technical constraints. Once you hit the character limit, it won't let you do more. So you have to work within the constraints of that particular context effectively. Now, an example of someone kind of problem solving around this is, I remember there would be a time some people would tweet and they would, instead of, they didn't worry about the 140 character thing because Twitter was their social media platform. They didn't do Facebook or anything else. And so what they would do is they would send out 5 different tweets of 140 characters to get their full paragraph of thought as they were ranting or whatever it was. And so maybe 10 posts instead of 5. But when a lot of times when people would do that and it was like ping, 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 and you had these 5 tweets all in a row, that was problem solving the technical constraint, but it was not necessarily working within the social constraint. And so it broke the genre of a tweet a little bit to do that series of posts that way. Someone found a workaround, but it actually then changed to our last category of constraints, which became a social constraint. So these are like social faux pas of writing based on the social context. It's kind of the same thing as when something goes out of style fashion-wise, don't wear white after Labor Day and all that fun stuff, or when you go against the expectations of your reader. And so, what would be more effective potentially is play with the various social media platforms. And if you wanted to do a giant paragraph of things, post it to Facebook, then share a link to the Facebook post on Twitter instead of having 5 or 10 really short posts. But the thing that would constrain you here is not necessarily the technology, because you found a workaround. It wasn't a physical constraint, but it became a social constraint where you are finding an audience that disapproves. And it basically says, what were you thinking? Why did you do this? Oh, no, you didn't. Oh, no, you didn't. Right. So those are the 3 main types of constraints that I come across. There are all different ways that these may apply in your everyday life. And it can be a lot of fun to really dig in, especially if you tie this to all the different types of writing technologies you could study throughout history. So if you're a history buff, it can be really cool if you think about different eras and types of communication, and as they develop, you can start thinking about, well, what was the thing that made someone want a better thing? What was the problem with the current technology that caused someone to innovate and create a new one? That can be a lot of fun. At what point did people decide that animal blood and blueberry juice was just not cutting it, and they wanted something that was going to last a little longer? So they found a way to make a chisel and carve into wood or whatever, depending on what part of the world, and all that fun stuff. So these are this is constraints and limitations components of the rhetorical aspect of writing. They link to considerations of accessibility and usability in the technological aspect of writing, and it can just be a lot of fun to think through how these different things might show up with everyday stuff. So hopefully you had fun. Enjoy, and just as a quick review, if you're struggling like Tom Hanks, find another way, problem solve, open all the packages. If you make sure you're keeping your phone charged, be thankful when people adapt to customer feedback, and decide whether you care what other people think. So those all matter. Have a good day.